So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth pre-Congress workshop on the Colombo Conference 2021. This is regarding rethinking assessments. So as you all know, learning, when you learn something, it is always linked to assessments. And there are several alternative methods of assessments that have been studied and has been evolving throughout the medical education and throughout the years. And due to the current pandemic-like situation, we have been all over the world, medical education and assessment has been facing a lot of problems. And we have been thinking of e-assessments as part of understanding the assessment process in medical education. There are several practical issues that we face when we do these type of assessments. There are advantages, disadvantages, and barriers. So I think with the end of this workshop, we should be able to understand most of these concepts. And I hope you all enjoy the workshop during this session, few hours. And we will also consider the reliability and validity as well as when you're doing the assessment will also be considered. So to conduct these workshops, we have three eminent people. Dr. Mark Lilicrap, he's a clinical sub-dean and chair of the graduate course admissions, School of Clinical Medicine, Cambridge University, United Kingdom. And of course, we have Professor Gominda Ponnamperuma from Department of Medical Education, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo, and also Dr. Rajaratnam Mathialagan. He's a consultant physician and gastroenterologist at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, UK. He'll be talking to you all about communication assessments because he has conducted these in the UK and is known to do this process online. So let me invite you all to this workshop and please do enjoy the workshop, and I will hand over the program to the resource person. So over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So we have about maybe 28 participants at the moment. So we are going to open the workshop with a group activity. So I'm sure some other participants will join later, but until such time, I think we will, in the interest of time, we will open the breakout rooms. So this is the initial activity that we want you to engage in. And this activity, do not take it very seriously, but deliberate at least, and do not discuss extensively because you will not have time to do that. But spend around 7-8 minutes and try to identify what are your experiences and ideas about e-assessment. Think of possibilities, advantages, disadvantages, and barriers. So if you can think of 1 or 2 possibilities, 1 or 2 advantages, 1 or 2 disadvantages, and 1 or 2 barriers, I think that's what is expected because you have around 10 minutes. So we will open about, let's say, so am I clear on that? Do you have any queries as to what you need to do? If so, please unmute and raise any query, or you can chat. So possibilities, advantages, disadvantages, and barriers of e-learning, e-assessment. You will have to discuss a little bit, and after 10 minutes, we will call you back to the main session, and you will have to tell us what your thoughts were. What did you discuss? So with that note, if you do not have any query or any clarifications, shall I open breakout rooms? Maybe since there are about, yeah, Mark, do you have to say anything on that?
Can I just suggest that each group has one spokesperson, so that when we feed back later, one of you from each group just tells us one or two of the key things that you have discussed that you can share with the larger group after you've had your discussions. But I think we should split you into your breakout groups. You'll probably be in groups of about 5 or 6. So I would probably suggest 6 breakout groups. Does that sound good, Gominda?
That's great. Okay, here we go. We open breakout rooms.
There's a few people who haven't managed to join breakout groups. If you've got problems getting into your breakout group, can you just unmute yourself and just let us know, and we will check which group you're supposed to be in. You should have had an invite to join a breakout group. Right, there's one group, Gominda, with only 2 people. So I'm going to go in and tell them I'll move them to another group.
Oh, yeah, I think that would be good, Mark. Yeah. That group can be dissolved.
Yeah, but they need to know, so I'll just go and join them.
Then the room 5.
Yeah, I'm going in there. I'll go into room 5 and then I'll join them with room 3.
Did you manage, Mark? There is one more person. We will have to move her to, I think she had joined late, room 5. We will move her to room 6 probably. All right, she did that. We can move to room 3.
So Gominda, actually that's worked quite nicely. So we have 5 groups of 5.
Yeah, correct, correct.
So we can give them a bit longer, can't we, at the moment?
How many more minutes do you think, Mark?
So how many
more minutes should we allow them?
Well, I would allow them a little bit longer to have a discussion. We can send messages.
Yes, in fact, I have typed one. I just want to know how many minutes to give. I said we will close breakout rooms in.
Should we give them another 5 minutes?
Okay, great.
Good morning, Vidya. I'm just going to allocate you to a break. Okay. Just going to allocate you to a breakout group, Vidya. We're just discussing experiences of e-assessment, things that are good, things that have been a problem.
Mark, will you lead the discussion? I can tell you the rooms and some of the names of those who.
Yes, I can see the names of the people who are in the different rooms, so I can see all the breakout groups. Yeah. I'm happy to lead the discussion at this point. Did you want to somehow record this with a slide or something in terms of advantages, disadvantages, and barriers? Because we could put a little slide together with this on, or if you want, I can put a slide together a little bit later while you're doing your debrief.
Oh, that's great.
That's fine. I can definitely do that.
So you mean the putting together the slides means whether when that is the individual presentations that we have, or
no, I'm thinking when the people present their key things,
right,
we would normally record that on a flip chart. And so what I would suggest is that we put a slide together that we come back to a little bit later on this afternoon.
Okay.
With that information. Now we've got a few people who aren't in groups at the moment, so I suggest that we allocate. In fact, we've only got 2 minutes left. So if we start closing breakout groups at 6 minutes to. So I'm just translating the times into Sri Lankan time.
No, so, never mind.
Yeah, that at 13:54, if we press close rooms, they'll get a minute to come back then.
Correct. Yeah. Sure. Will do. And I have opened a new file so that I can type that in.
Okay.
Where different groups will say different.
Yeah, but I can do that while I'm debriefing. Don't worry, because right. I've got a notepad here to make notes on.
Oh, okay.
And when it is appropriate, I can then share that slide.
Yeah. Only thing is, what my experience is that they can't remember to which group, because these groups are just numbers 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
So they can't remember to which group that they belong to. So we have to. I will prompt them with some names so that then they will realize.
Yeah. So if I name a room, if you could come up with a few names from that room as to people who might present.
Sure.
That would be great.
Sure.
Okay, shall we close the breakout groups then, Gominda? So welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had an opportunity to discuss a bit about your own experiences of e-assessment over the past year or two. So we're wanting you to think about what are the potential advantages of e-assessment, what are the disadvantages and what might be the barriers, and pick up a little bit about your own experiences, because you'll have all adapted assessments in some way. And it's interesting to share good experiences, challenges. So what we're going to do is we'll go around each of the groups, and I'm hoping you've all had a spokesperson for your group who's going to just feed back to the whole group a few key top tips, some what your thoughts were that you shared in your group. So I'm going to do this in a slightly random order. So let's start with room number 4. So did we have a spokesperson for room 4? I know, I think Tahini and Matthew were in room 4. Was there a spokesperson for room 4? Gominda, did you have any other names for room 4?
Dr. Kulanand, she's going to summarize.
Thank you very much, Tahini.
Thank you all. I'm Dr. Pushpa Kulanatha from Institute of Indigenous Medicine, University of Colombo. And our experience is different than our group members. We have done one major bar exam with in online, and also more than 3, I think 4 semester exams, and 2 research presentations. That was around students. That group it was around 20 students research presentation we have conducted by online. So in that way, we experienced overall we experienced the bar exam and always as well as the semester exam MCQs is advantageous for us to mark, but students they get very easy to copy, and the plagiarism they can very easily, because they share their answers to the online, and WhatsApp or some other way they get answers. So equal answers come very easily, as well as and even the structured essay, that also what they do, they get for screenshots and they share site, and then so we experience all similar same answer at the when we do paper marking at the CA means structured essay. And we didn't conduct essay questions because it was not easy to line up the exam. And we have done by exam we have done, but that was not all students get higher marks because of that situation. And semester exam we experienced because of the previous situation was not good, so we did proctored exam. So that way students got very limitations to do their own things, but we observed several students do something wrong, misconduct in their proctored exam. So we warned them and we asked them to not do them, but problem is that we can't force to the students because they have less infrastructure in there, so they can do whatever they want, and they get many excuses if we ask them to do the correct thing. So they get many, and problem earlier students were not happy to do exam online, but students some students asked to do the exam anyhow. We have to complete our aging in the institute. We don't want to get aged in here because don't pass unnecessary time here. Especially that situation arose from the female students, because they are reproductive age. They want to carry on their life as well as earlier to complete their course. We heard that at some other universities, the students were not happy to conduct online exams because that they have no facilities like that. They get some kind of issues they have shown. In that way, it was not easy to all the students, because that is, I think, much dedication from both sides to conduct these exams. I feel that how much administration forced to the students, then only students get agreed to do the exam. So otherwise, they will protect an administration if they don't take any step further. By the administration, students start to say, okay, we will wait until the COVID is finished and we will conduct physical exam, not online exam like that. Those kind of issues we feel we discuss at the group, in the group, and also at the I think if we conduct in some other advancement of our online facilities, this will be easy for us because it is time saving as well as some issues we had to overcome, because practicals we can't. We feel practicals, clinical practicals, we can't do this online way. I think this much we got shared. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Kulnathan. So let's go to room 1. So is there anyone in room 1? Gominda, have you got the names of people who are in room 1 who might be prepared to present?
Yeah, I'm Dilani. I'll be presenting what we have discussed in our group.
Yep, thank you.
Yes, as in the previous, the presenter, of course, the same issues we also had within our group also. One of the main issues is online, we cannot assess the practical exams. So to assess the clinical competencies. So, and the other thing, in the theoretical exams, like most of the faculties that we discussed in our group, they use it for the formative assessment only, not for the summative assessment, because one of the disadvantages that could have come with the cheating issues. So student might COVID, and so this cheating issues. So, and then we discussed actually these kind of things we can avoid if we have high technology, like once we open the exam browsers, like if we use Safe Exam browser, so then it minimizes the cheating with the other things, right? And if you use the two cameras, online and offline recordings, minimize the cheating. So we discussed about that, and the one of the problem that when we conduct the assessment we face is the connectivity, because many students face with the low bandwidth and then they lost the connection. So it's kind of associated with the fairness and equity for the each and every student. So one thing that we noted is that this is the online assessment. We can use for even peer assessment. Of course, we can use there is some kind of advantage. And the faculties that did assessment for the formative, they have done with the MCQs. So MCQ assessment with a certain period, but not for the structured or essays. Those are the main points that we discussed.
That's very helpful. I mean, I think we're all having to slightly rethink what assessment looks like, and you've both picked up challenges in terms of browsers and difficulties proctoring written papers. And do we need to move to written assessments which are open book, where students actually can access things, because it's very difficult to police them not accessing things, but you could then have more time pressure. The more you look up, the less time you've got to answer the question. So can you control the timings and things? So some great points there. Thank you. I'm going to move on to room 3. So in terms of room 3, did we have somebody from room 3 who's happy to speak?
I'm Galketi. I'm from the Department of Surgery from Peradeniya. I think it's probably, I'm just going to repeat what I said, but just to give a summary, what I feel is that most of the assessments could be done online, like MCQ, and then Vivas, and also time-based assignments. And about this people copying, of course, technology will help us, like by video monitoring and all that. And actually, in a difficult situation like COVID, it may be the only way, the assessment may be the only way how we can move forward with our assessments. Now I'm involved in final year assessment, where there's clinical exams where we give patients, they will have to do. So even those actually, I know some fellowships, they do, the examiners, they act like the patient and they give the history, the students assess, and even the other clinical cases, they show slides and they ask to take the history. But the thing is, to a certain extent, in a very difficult situation, it could be done. But my concern is more than the assessment of a patient by online, which could be done to some extent. The problem we face is how to train them I mean, the training them online is the more challenging one when it comes to clinical medicine. Assessment, I think always you can find means and do, which may be not the best, but of course you can have a good compromise if things are very difficult. And also it's mostly the training is the concern that I have. So I think we have to look into this. But even in non-COVID situations, if sometimes we may find some sections may be tested online, which will be easy. And in our country, there's another problem. Some students, the internet access, sometimes the internet may sort of have problems, and then there may be issues on that matter. They are all technical problems, which I think people can find solutions. So thank you.
Yeah. I think the technical issues are a global challenge. I think my experience of talking to people in most other countries, it's very difficult in terms of, as was picked up earlier, that the bandwidth and the connectivity for students can be a real challenge. We cannot assume that students necessarily have the kind of bandwidth we probably got this morning for this kind of session. And that makes it challenging when you're thinking about e-assessments. Yes, that's really helpful, picking up a bit about the clinical challenges. You know, how do we assess somebody's clinical competence, particularly if we're looking at this summatively when we're doing it online? And again, you're picking up the challenges. Yes, you can use photographs, you can have, you know, volunteers being assessed. There's a whole variety of ways that I think people have approached more remote delivery, but I think the clinical side is a particular challenge. We're going to come later to think a little bit about communication skills, and actually that can be migrated online, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on this morning. So there are approaches that we can take, but yes, thank you. Good to hear your experiences from Peradeniya. So if I go next to room 6, have we got a spokesperson from room 6?
Hello, good morning and good afternoon. And I'm Chanta from University of Peradeniya, from Faculty of Dental Sciences. Our group came up some ideas. First, I have to mention that these advantages and disadvantages depend on the learning outcome which we are going to test. And then for the advantages, as I heard before, in this situation, this is the only option we have. And it is easy to mark, especially like MCQ like questions with reshuffling and things. And then we can get the exam statistics, reliability, validity, everything at once. And then also we are close to green concept because we can minimize the paper usage. The disadvantage we see when we want to check hand skills, especially like tooth filling. So these things are not possible, we feel. Sometimes even maybe the clinical decisions and we may be able to check to a certain extent, but hand skills like cavity preparation, tooth filling are quite we feel like impossible. And other things like cheating and those things are already discussed. And the barrier identified is in our context is the connectivity and the device problem. And also sometimes the mindset among even the students and also the staff members. So thank you. Those are the things our group came up. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting what you finished with there in the mindset. I think there is something about the sort of tacit knowledge which we utilize within the work environment that we find ourselves. And one of the challenges that hasn't been discussed so much is when we do assessments and somebody isn't within the working environment, how does that impact on their ability to appropriately utilize their knowledge? And it becomes quite artificial. So I think I like that point about the mindset of the students and the assessors when it's a more remote e-assessment that's being undertaken. Thank you. So that's room 6 and final group, which I believe is room number 2. Do we have a spokesperson from room number 2?
So group number 2.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sanchayan, representing room number 2. So yeah, the most of the issues that we discussed have been stated. We thought about in terms of possibilities, in-course assessments and formative assessments, especially formative assessments, maybe a good place to start e-assessments or implement e-assessments. Even open book assessments could be helpful for that. But summative assessments will be difficult. Maybe there's a possibility of having mixed assessments. We don't know. That's tricky. So vivas are quite a e-assessments are could be quite helpful in viva like exams. And the advantage there is people can take part as examiners from different locations, even the candidates or the assessors. We wondered how e-assessments will affect favorism by teachers. How would that be? Would it prevent favorism by being monitored, or would it go unnoticed? We don't know. Disadvantages, we identified the same disadvantages, and we also came up with the same, the sharing, plagiarism and cheating, and the same solutions were discussed, like restricting time, asking the students to declare that they will not be cheating and using software and proctoring. The same barriers, connectivity and the device. That's the summary of what we were able to discuss.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think the key thing I'd take out, so as you've highlighted, vivas may actually be an advantage online, and actually going forward where we're doing those sort of face-to-face discussions, it enables you to get examiners from, potentially all around the globe to work on those sort of viva exams. But I think your comment about bias is interesting, because it links in with the connectivity. Are we actually biased in terms of the quality of somebody's internet connection when we're assessing somebody in a viva online, which is a very interesting point. So thank you. We've picked up some really interesting ideas from those discussions. So we picked up a bit about written papers and e-assessment using written papers, some of the advantages, some of the environmental benefits, which, given it's COP26 at the moment, and that is useful to think about, reduced paper consumption and things, but some of the challenges around proctoring that. Do we need to rethink the way that we do written assessments if we're doing them online, because of the problems with people accessing information and potentially plagiarizing and working with others? We've thought a little bit about clinical and practical exams and the specific challenges there, and what can we and can't we do in terms of practical exams. Some interesting thoughts about vivas, and we thought a bit about the difference between formative and summative, and how do we need to think about formative versus summative assessments in terms of e-assessment, and a bit about the candidates and how do we approach those candidates. Lots of concerns about connectivity. What about the mindset, both of the students and the assessors? What about our risks of bias? And we've heard from a number of groups some of the benefits in terms of validity and reliability of assessments. So really helpful thoughts. Hopefully that's just got you thinking a little bit about e-assessments and the concepts, and a bit about the challenges that we face. I'm going to hand back to Gominda, who's going to talk a little bit more about our approaches to e-assessment and discuss a little bit further some of these issues that have been raised. So thank you, everybody. Thank you particularly for those of you who presented. Back to you, Gominda.
Thank you, Mark. I hope you can see my slides. Yeah, so this is the activity we just now went through, and it was truly a refreshing activity because I hope in terms of many things we are on the same page, so that helps. So what I would be doing during the next few minutes would probably give a broad background on how we could approach e-assessment. Now, many people I know approach e-assessment as a technical issue. Of course, technicalities are involved in e-assessment. You have to take note of it. But also you can approach it as an educational issue. So what I would like to approach it, because some of the technicalities we have to live with them. We can't do much about it. But if you approach e-assessment from an educational point of view, despite the technicalities or technical issues, how we can make use of e-assessment to our advantage can be thought of in a different way, which would be quite useful. To start with, I have picked up a definition of e-assessment, because before starting anything, we have to know what it is. So this is my definition of e-assessment. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds. If you Google, you will find hundreds and hundreds of definitions. So this is one such definition. Assessment that uses electronic or digital technologies in any of its activities, from planning through implementation to evaluation of assessment. So I am going to pick on this any of it.
Excuse me, your slide, you're not on slideshow.
Oh, I am. Oh, sorry.
No, we only see your activity slide.
Oh, sorry. Then let me. Okay. Okay, I will unshare and share again. Probably that will solve the issue. Hopefully. Do you see my slide? What is e-assessment?
No, at the moment we're seeing your web page. So if you
okay. Okay, that's an issue. Okay, let me. Okay, here we go.
That's good.
Okay, so do you see a yellow box? Let me. Okay, I hope you can see a yellow box.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the definition that I read to you. Assessment that uses electronic or digital technologies in any of its activities, from planning through implementation to evaluation of assessment. So I'm going to pick on this activity part. So what are some of the activities it has listed, the definition itself refers to, like planning, implementation, evaluation of assessment. So I would like you to think of the assessment in this broader sense, rather than only delivering an exam through digital media, through the internet. I mean, that's a very narrow way of looking at e-assessment, but we could think of e-assessment and trying to use e-assessment in the entire spectrum of an assessment cycle. So an assessment cycle would be something like this. If you start from the 12 o'clock position here, so we start with planning. Planning is usually the main planning tool would be blueprint, and then item writing. Then some of the things that you thought of when you have written the item, or when you have designed the OSCE station or whatever, you think of, if it is a summative exam, test security or item security. then of course you have to ensure that. And then you have to set a standard, which is a pass-fail score. Then probably you could, you will have to administer it. When you are administering it online, then there will be special things to consider, some of which you have already mentioned. Then evaluation of feedback once the exam is over. Whatever the scores will be calculated, and then we have to evaluate whether what is the validity, what is the reliability, and also evaluate whether the scores that the candidates scored were in line with what we expected, and also give some feedback to the candidate. And finally, if we find that some of our items, questions, OSCE stations, scenarios, or whatever we used are useful, we could bank them. So in the entirety of this cycle, we can think of how electronic devices or digital technology can help us. And I would be going through very, very briefly just to set the stage. And this is, by the way, only one way of thinking, but there can be many ways of thinking to make use of electronic technology to help us in the entire cycle, not just one or two. Sometimes, due to various reasons, we may not be able to get the help of technology in all these stages of the cycle. That's fine. Whatever we can make use of technology. Whatever we can't, we could think of another way of doing it, but also think of how we can make use of technology, at least at some other point, to get our things done better for those stages that we could not use digital technology to help us. So I'll be going through each of these ovals or each of these stages very briefly. So blueprinting is deciding what to test. What are the competencies? What are the content areas? So for that, technology can be used very readily, because even if usually we meet together, examiners, and then decide on the items to be included. But if that is not possible, then probably you could do it online. There are online tools to do it. So this is a traditional type of an exam blueprint, where you do it on paper. But if you cannot meet and do it on paper, there are very many tools to select the items that you want to include in the exam. So the same process can be done through an electronic system, where you have all the items, and then you can select the items that you want. If you can see the ticks that I have included here, and then you can, once you have ticked, you can view the blueprint. And if you are not happy, you can deselect some of them. If you think that the entire blueprint has not been met, you can deselect some certain things, and this is the sort of the blueprint you will get. And for each of these, we can click each of these items and go to the item itself, right? Go to the item itself and see whether what we have selected is appropriate. If not, we can deselect and select another one. So that makes life quite easy if you can do that. About item writing. Again, item writing has been a very sort of a personal thing, where you write your exam question, your model answer, your marking scheme, and then send. If it is a MCQ exam, you write your question and the options and the correct answer. Well, you can do the same thing online, probably better. Why I say better is, There are certain rules that we have to, whether we develop an OSCE station or an MCQ, there are certain rules that we need to follow. So those rules are well laid down and well documented. Now, for example, if you think of an MCQ, there are a lot of rules like this, where you have to adhere to when you are writing, before writing, while writing, after writing, what are the verbs that you can use, what are the things that you can't do, what are the things that you can do, lots of do's and don'ts that you have to keep in mind. Or you will have to keep this sort of a guideline near you, close by, and refer to it very often. But if you think of an online system where you select what you have to write using different components, and then when you write, see, if you see here, this is my scenario, this is my question, and then some of those rules you can operationalize through the digital media, where it will flag up some of the problems that your question may have. So this is such a flag up that you see. So then you don't need to always go to the guideline. Guideline is now inbuilt electronically, and it comes up with suggestions. Don't use this, don't you do this, there is a problem here. So that makes the exam question writers' life that much easier. Again, at the end of the writing of the question, there can be checklists like this. Have I done this? Have I done this? Have I done this? So the writer will have to see to it and check it. And then only that it will allow you to save. So that's sort of a, so in a way, what we are thinking of is, we are thinking of a system where like somebody near you, taking you through the steps, holding your hand and taking you through the steps. So you don't need to remember all the steps, or whether you have forgotten something or anything like that. So that is a tremendous advantage in terms of writing questions. I took an example of a MCQ or a written question. It will be the same for an OSCE or a clinical exam. Then, of course, once you have written, you are worried about whether your test item is secure. That is, at least until the exam is held, nobody will get your question, so that then there will be a leaked question where certain candidates will have an advantage over the others. So for that, I think the existing technologies may not be perfect. I think if I am not mistaken, anything can be hacked these days. But of course, I mean, you see a lot of banking systems and all these are defense systems are quite robust. So some of the things that we could adopt would be like, now this is a sort of a administrator's guide for a digital item bank, where you have passwords, and each password has the things that that person can do and cannot do. So if you are a writer, you can access only your exam questions, not the others' exam questions. Because if you can access everything, then if your password is maybe stolen, then entire exam bank will be at risk. So certain guidelines could be followed. And also, when you are logging in, we call it a two-factor login, where just because you have a password, you can't log in. When you enter a password, just like a banking system, when you have a password, when you enter the password, and when that password matches with the system, it will send you another email or a short message to your phone saying that there is a PIN also to be included. And when the PIN is also included, only that you will be taken in. So there can be a lot of such security systems. Then a standard setting, again, standard setting is usually done in a group. face-to-face and on paper or on a board. So if you think of a common standard setting method like a modified Angoff, the same can be done through this. This is what you see at the bottom is actual standard setting procedure, and what you see at the left top corner is an electronic format where you can do the same thing. Then test administration, I think many talked about it, like things like test security, confidentiality of marks, and even copying type of thing. So again, proctoring systems are there, but proctoring systems are not perfect. And if you think that you are making certain candidates or putting certain candidates at an advantage, well, you can revert back to traditional test administration, but that does not mean that all these other steps need to be abandoned also. Of course, permitting the COVID situation. Of course, if the COVID situation is not permitting, then what many of us do is we keep the entire cohort of students in a sort of a quarantine area and then take few at a time and then administer the test face-to-face. But even if not, even pre-COVID, most of us, the sort of summative exams, we happen to, even if we digitally administer it, we brought the students to a big exam hall. But that's the traditional type of thinking. I think Mark alluded to it in his discussion with you. That is, if we view this problem as a technical or technological problem. But if we think of this problem as an educational problem, then, well, if you think that you put certain candidates at an advantage by delivering the exam digitally so that they can communicate the answer with another person using some other app, well, in that case, why not think differently? So, for example, an open book exam, where you don't worry whether you speak to another person or not, because you are allowed to sort of see other material. But then our question writing will have to be changed. We can't ask a recall question. We will have to ask to test higher order thinking. And together with appropriate timing, there will be less possibilities for a person to sort of cheat or ask somebody the answer, because you will not be giving that much of time to discuss with the person and then answer. So, and it's just not a matter of just selecting the answer. You will have to, they will have to show how they worked it out. So with all that, so it's an educational solution, not a technological solution, because there is so much that the technology can do. At a certain point, we will have to stop manipulating the technology, and we will have to find educational answers to the problems we face. So that's about exam administration. Of course, I mean, administering an exam online is no issue. I mean, with a bank like this, it's very easy. You can select the answers, you can select the questions, and then you can view them, add to the paper, and you can create a paper very easily with this sort of a button. But that's only, so that bit can be done anyway with the use of technology. But when it comes to administering, well, you will have to take a close look as to where you stop using technology, and if you want to use technology, how it can be used with some educational solutions, like testing higher order thinking, and then making it open book, but manipulating time in such a way that everybody is at the same level or on an equal platform. Evaluation and feedback. Of course, this has happened even, I think technology is best known for this, not particularly feedback, but evaluation. Most of our assessment software would do this, like calculating the reliability, calculating the difficulty index, calculating the discrimination index. So that is quite easy. I mean, if you look at each of these questions, if you click them, you will get all these figures: difficulty, discrimination, alpha reliability, and distractor analysis, and so on. And this is such a screenshot of that. And then also digitally, they can flag bad questions or questions which do not have optimum item statistics. So that is this red one. That means don't use it unless you change it, because one administration has given rise to somewhat suboptimal item statistics. Feedback, of course, pre-COVID, we have never given feedback online, but there are lots of dashboards nowadays where you can give a lot of information to the candidate. So what is your score, for example? This is the candidate score. And this is the bar that you find, horizontal bar that you find is the class average. So you can analyze the exam results in many, many ways so that the individual student gets an idea as to where he or she stands. And this is another way of graphing where you see, you can longitudinally profile the candidate marks so that do we see that the candidate improves as time goes on, or is the candidate plateauing, for example. So all those can be worked out very well, and that will be very useful feedback both to the teacher as well as to the candidate. Finally, of course, item banking. Once you have done all that, all these steps, if you think that there are certain items that you can reuse, certainly you could bank them. Sometimes you may have to bank them with modification if the results that you got were not the ones that you expected. There were some suboptimal item statistics. So you could bank in a bank like this, and then you can reuse by just ticking each of these and then taking it to the exam paper and then either printing that paper or delivering it online. So this sort of a traffic light system will tell you what are the good items, what are the not so good items, and what are the, in terms of item statistics. That will help you to select. Yeah, these are some of the other screenshots where you can get the help of technology to sort of exactly find out how many questions do I have on this subject area with assessing these competencies. You can just click some buttons and then you will get the entire bank, and then you can select. And if you click something like this, you will get the history of that question. How many times has it been administered? Did I include that last year also? Then I should not include this year. The item analysis history also can be sort of, if you have administered it 5 times, what is the average difficulty you get? So that can also be worked out. Right, that's the entire cycle. Now I basically took you through this cycle in one of the traditional sort of written exam. But if you look at many other exams, this is the entire Miller's pyramid, where we divide all the exams into 4 categories. That is assessment of knows, assessment of knows how, assessment of shows how, and assessment of does. Knows and knows how would be largely written exams. When I say written exams, I also include screen-based exams where you can type an answer or select an answer on a screen. And these are the methods that we use: MCQs, short answer questions, structured essay questions. Then shows how and does are behavior-related assessments where OSCE, long case, short case would be at a shows how level, because we ask the candidate to show to us what they can do. But when the candidate does it real time, in a real clinical setting. It will be assessing at the desk level. So logbooks, portfolios, all these can be digitalized. All these have been digitalized. So it's a matter of figuring out what suits us best. Just because there is a facility, I don't think we should use. We should customize it to the best possible way. So this is just to show that e-assessment can be used anywhere in the Miller's pyramid. Of course, prior planning and knowing what we can do and knowing what we should do, all these are educational decisions, are the main aspects that we need to think of when we are planning an e-assessment. And as I said earlier, we don't need to go through the entire cycle electronically, through electronic means. We can select the stages of the cycle that we are comfortable with. We can make use of e-assessment or make use of electronic technologies. And then focus on that for the moment and explore how we can take the other few steps also so that the entire cycle can be digitalized. So that's where I stop. Before I sort of stop, I don't think this slide is any longer necessary because you gave a lot of issues like stability of the connection, issues of coping, impersonations, plagiarism, issues related to text security, staff unfamiliarity with technology, inability to assess physical examination and hands-on skills, difficulties in giving one-to-one face-to-face feedback, and so on. But I think all these, these are issues, but all these have solutions. So I'm sure you will get some tips from the other resource persons as we move along. Thank you very much. If you have any queries, I'm happy to answer. If not, I'm sure we can discuss all of us together as we move on.
Thank you, Gominda. That was a fantastic overview. I like your life cycle of assessment as a framework that we can use. I just want to pick up, if it's okay, just in terms of while people are thinking about questions about that exam administration side, and just sort of two thoughts really. The first of which you mentioned briefly was the open book idea and whether that's something you've actually tried. And the second sort of technological thing, and one of the advantages of technology, is when you're putting the exam together, you've probably got 150 single best answer questions that you might be using in a paper. Delivering it remotely rather than on paper, there is technology that you can randomly mix the questions. So every candidate gets the same question, but every candidate gets the question in a different order. And that can reduce plagiarism. And I don't know, is that something that you've tried locally in terms of when you're administering these exams?
To be honest, Mark, I think most of us have not gone there. These were the possibilities, but I think in terms of assignments, even pre-COVID, assignments most of the time were digitally submitted. And probably as in many parts of the world, and those submissions are put through a plagiarism sort of software, where the software checks with previous submissions and as well as other internet sources, and then you give a percentage of overlap the material that they have produced with. But again, I think it's very useful. It's very useful. But you have to be very cautious in interpreting those the results that the software gives, because software is not a human.
Absolutely. I mean, we have been working on developing the sort of randomization idea. Because we think that might be a solution to some of the proctoring concerns that have been highlighted. But has anyone else got any other questions? If you've got a question, you can use your reactions button and just stick your hand up. Reactions buttons along the bottom, or just unmute yourself. Geetanjali, did you have a question? I can see you put your video on.
No, Mark, I just put my hand up. But I thought in terms of the Sri Lankan situation, we are still working a lot on the primitive side, I think, because of the problem of resources. That is one of the drawbacks. I think Gominda also pointed out that. That is what I would like to reiterate again. And also the mental setup. We are not really prepared to handle anything online. Still, a lot of us are unsure of whether this will work and this will be correct. Will our students have difficulties? Will they be able to handle this kind of situations? Or they are still in the minds?
Yes, yeah. And I'd reiterate, I don't think that's a Sri Lankan specific issue. We have challenges with our students don't have access to the technology. They don't have good bandwidth. We've been having to provide rooms locally with computers and internet access that students can use that are suitably socially distanced, because actually they just haven't got the technology at home. They haven't got access directly. So, you know, challenges with the technology aren't specific to individual countries. Any other questions for Gominda or comments in terms of written assessments particularly?
Can I just make a comment? I'm Kosa.
Yes, Kosala, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just want to make this comment, but yes, we in the medical faculties have not made use of open books and all these e-assessments. But I see when I go to the Senate, lots of other faculties, including Faculty of Arts, approval is given for open book exams, right? And I hear in management, some of my colleagues say their children, from the day one, they did all these e-exams. I think one of the management faculties in Colombo University. So they had all the exams at the right time. Just a comment.
I think you are absolutely right. I think many other fields have gone into this much ahead of us, but we are still probably not too sure whether this will work or not. But for that, the best would be run a pilot with formative assessment, see how it works. And if it works, I think sooner or later we'll have to do that. As things go on, the way that the things go at the moment, I think that will have to happen sooner or later. And then at least we know what works and what doesn't work.
I would entirely agree with you, Gominda. I think, again, I'd pick up something you said really nicely in your presentation. I think it's an educational challenge rather than necessarily a technological challenge. And actually, if we look at the way that our students learn, it's not about rote learning and regurgitation necessarily of facts. It's about application of knowledge. And if you think what many of us will do in our clinical work, you know, we access information within the context, not with every patient. Intermittently, we'll want to look something up, we'll cross-check something. And actually, open book exams may be educationally more valid as a way of assessing. But as Gominda highlighted, if you're using an open book kind of approach, as a number of management schools and things will do, then we need to think differently about how we structure our questions, because we need to be thinking, come back to basic educational theory, Bloom's taxonomy. You're looking at using much more creative kind of questions, and they're more challenging to write. And that becomes a challenge for us as educators as to how do we write questions that are pushing somebody to apply knowledge rather than just assess basic facts.
I think I agree with you, Mark, completely. I think what you said is exactly, I think, what we need to discuss further and probably allay some of our fears that, we may be having in terms of not knowing what it is. So when something is not known, there will be a lot of ifs and buts. But I think the best way to get rid of those is to do a sort of a test pilot and see whether what works and what doesn't work.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can I make a question? Now, in open book exam or any other online exams, so when we make the test within a scheduled time, the typing speed of the student matters on the quality of the answer. So in these circumstances, I mean, is it right to evaluate the hand skill or the typing skill in addition to the subject content? Is that clear?
Yeah, no, I think that's very clear, and it is a definite issue that we need to think about in terms of how much time we give, and there is ongoing debate around this in terms of how much time do you need to allow? Do you need a little bit more time with a written paper to allow for typing speed? But equally, in a clinical context, you work under time pressure. And so actually what you don't want is an open-ended amount of time to look up as much as you want. You actually need to be strategic in terms of an open book exam. So you probably do need to take account of some of average typing speed, but equally you don't want to have as long as you want to do this, because otherwise people will start looking up answer absolutely every question, and that's not valid in terms of what happens in practice. Gominda.
I think, Mark, you're absolutely right. Again, my point of piloting and finding out how long will an average student take to type an answer. Because, I mean, even if you take it several years, I mean, take it back to the traditional mode, the writing speed also matters when you are asking for a written answer. So what we have done is we have said, okay, an average student takes this much of time to write the answer. So you set the paper that way. So the same we'll have to adopt in when you use technology. We'll have to ask ourselves how much time an average student may spend to type an answer, and accordingly you will have to build in time.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment answer. But however, when we compare with the paper and pencil test, especially in the Sri Lankan context, students are not familiar with the keyboards thing. I mean, compared to pen and pencil.
And I think this will evolve. I don't think there is a clear answer. I think your point's well made, that how do we accommodate typing speed if typing isn't something that people are familiar with? And that's sort of comes back to Gominda's life cycle of assessment in terms of how you plan your assessment has to take that into account. But I don't think we're going to be able to give you a clear answer to that, I'm afraid, but it's a really good point, Janta.
Okay, thank you.
I'm aware of time, and we need to give you a little bit of a break before the next session. I've just put up a summary slide here, just from your discussions from your breakout group. So you looked in terms of e-assessment advantages, disadvantages, barriers. So you've looked at written assessment, benefits for the environment, practical to deliver potentially, linking in with what Gominda's just been describing. Some of the challenges of administration and proctoring, which again, Gominda's addressed there in his presentation, and some of the technological challenges, which, you know, it's an evolving picture that you've identified with some of your questions there. You looked at user issues, both the user as the student and the user as the assessor, technological limitations, bandwidth, the mindset, and perhaps we should add to that challenges of things like typing skills. We're going to come back to bias of assessors within environments a bit later. So we've started to look at some of those issues. We're going to have a brief break now and reconvene at past, and we're going to move and look a little bit more at practical based exams. Gominda's touched briefly on OSCEs. We're going to pick up on OSCEs and how we might use them, some of the practical challenges that we've had experience of developing OSCE-like exams. So what I'd suggest is everybody takes a 5-minute break, stretch your legs. We will reconvene to kick off again at 9:30. Sorry, it's 3 o'clock Sri Lankan time. Sorry, I'm talking in UK time. So we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock. And we'll look a little bit at how this works within an OSCE setting. Welcome back, everybody. I'm just going to allow another sort of 30 seconds or so just to let everybody log back on again. Hopefully you've had a stretch and are back ready to kick off. So we've thought so far a little bit about written assessments. We've thought about the general principles around e-assessment, and we're going to pick up a little bit on that and move on to think a little bit about some of the sort of station-based approaches, and whether they are approaches that can work, what are the limitations. That we'll pick up some of the things again that you discussed in your breakout groups earlier. So I'm going to look at 3 areas in this next half hour. We're going to look again a little bit at assessment methodology and frameworks and apply that a little bit to skills-based assessments. We're going to look at how that applies particularly to OSCEs, some of the experience that we've had locally. And I'm going to use a particular type of OSCE, a multiple mini interview, or an MMI, as an example of something that we have worked with over the past couple of years with the COVID challenges, and which actually we found works really well. And we are going to continue with that, despite the fact that we could go back to doing this as a face-to-face. We think that the benefits actually outweigh the challenges for MMI. So we're going to continue to do an entirely remotely delivered multiple mini interview going forward. And so I'll look at why that is. So I'd just like to start off picking up some of the same principles that Gominda touched on earlier, and which was also picked up a little bit in the chat in terms of assessment informing learning. And it's important, as Gitanjali started off the session, to highlight that assessment is part of the whole learning process, and we shouldn't be viewing assessment in isolation. We need to link it in, and we need to link it in with intended learning outcomes. And so always the first part of that process of constructive alignment of our teaching is to define our learning outcomes within the appropriate educational level. And then we need to map our assessment methodology onto that, and we need to map our learning and teaching activities to that, so that we conceive our educational programs as a whole. And this was work from John Biggs back in the late 1990s, looking at this concept of constructive alignment. What should our students know? How will they learn it? And how can we then tell if they've learned what we think they should have learned? And so we need good intended learning outcomes. We need teaching and learning activities that map to those learning outcomes. And we need assessments and evaluations that map to those and enable us to assess whether or not learning has taken place. So it's part of the whole educational process. And so we assess both for learning and we assess learning. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And there are 3 key questions really that we as educators always want to be thinking about when we're planning any assessment. And you've already picked up many of these in your earlier discussions. The first question is, why are you doing it? The second is, what are you assessing? And the third is, how are you actually going to go about assessing it? Looking first at why are you doing the assessment picks up on what a number of groups highlighted earlier, which is formative or summative. So are you planning this for learning or of learning? So formative assessment is a useful analogy is what you do when you're cooking, when you taste to check how things are going. Do I need to add a little bit more salt? That's what you're doing as part of the learning process. Whereas summative assessment is what the guests say when they go and taste the soup. So really important that we start off by thinking, is what we're going to do formative or summative assessment? So looking at that in a bit more detail. So again, I saw in the chat earlier a helpful phrase somebody used. Formative assessment is assessment for learning. So it helps students to go around the learning cycle, to learn and to practice. And so Formative assessment sits regularly within the course. It's linked heavily with feedback to the students, and feedback is a core component because what we're trying to do is to support learning, to activate their knowledge frameworks, identify where the gaps are in conjunction with the students, and then support them to learn from that. So that's very much around formative assessment. Summative assessment is what we do at the end of a program. So it's the guest tasting the soup. Has the student met a predefined criteria? Can they jump the hurdle? It's very much of a yes/no answer in terms of whether or not somebody has achieved it. So formative assessment is information for learning. It links with feedback on current student performance, and it should encourage reflective practice amongst our students. Summative assessment, by contrast, is assessment of learning, and it feeds in at the end of a program to say, have you achieved everything that you need to achieve from this assessment? So here are some key things that will help you distinguish summative and formative assessment. And as I highlighted, as educators, we need to keep these things very much in the forefront of our thinking when we're planning the kind of assessments that we might want to do. So summative assessment, much more challenging in terms of ensuring security and the proctoring kind of process. Formative assessment is much more about feedback and sometimes can work better in terms of that online kind of assessment process. So having thought why you're doing it, what are you going to assess? And that links in with Bloom's taxonomy in terms of knowledge, skills, and attitude. And we want to think, are we going to be assessing factual knowledge, applied knowledge? Are we assessing skills? We heard about some of the challenges of dental skills earlier. Are we assessing communication skills, skills like literature review, if you're teaching more of the preclinical science? Or are we assessing attitudes and behaviors? And if we look at assessment methodologies, we always want to think about, are we assessing against those intended learning outcomes? And picking up what Gominda highlighted earlier, blueprinting is absolutely key in this process. So remembering constructive alignment, our assessment needs to link with the intended learning outcomes, and our teaching and learning activities need to support delivery of those learning outcomes. So when we're thinking about what are we going to assess, we should be assessing against those particular learning outcomes. So finally, how are you going to assess it? We've already touched on a number of these areas, but we can assess knowledge, we can assess skills, and we can assess attitude. And there are different ways that we can do that. And we can look at that in the with a variety of these acronym named assessments. So we have SBAs and VSAs, OSCEs and WPBAs, MSF and SJTs. If you're feeling overwhelmed, here's what we mean. So if we're looking to assess attitude, what we really want to do is look what actually happens in real life and how somebody actually behaves. So things like multi-source feedback, 360-degree feedback are very good for assessing attitudinal approaches, and we can sometimes use what's called situational judgment tests, which are SJTs, which are used quite a lot in the UK, particularly in terms of application for postgraduate training programs. OSCEs, objective structured clinical exams, are very much looking to assess skills in a simulated environment, and we're going to think about how that might work online. WPBAs are workplace-based assessments, and they're a good way of assessing skills in real life, and again are used as an assessment strategy, both formatively and summatively in a lot of postgraduate training programs. And then we've got SBAs and VSAs. We've talked already about single best answer questions, which are a type of multiple choice question where there's one answer which is most appropriate from 5 that Gominda's really picked up on with his earlier discussions. Just so people are aware, there's a move and interest in what's called very short answer questions, where it looks like a single best answer. And Gominda showed you earlier a template, an online template for writing your single best answer questions. With a very short answer question, you don't put any options for the student. So whereas normally there's 5 potential answers that a student selects from, with very short answer questions, they just type into the box what they think the answer might be. And you use computer learning to assess whether or not the answer is appropriate. And you need to start that process with just an assessor reviewing them. But after a while, you get standard texts which the computer will recognize as being appropriate answers. So interest in that as a way forward, because single best answers do tend to queue responses, whereas very short answers test much more the depth of learning. So watch this space for VSAs. And we've already seen about Miller's pyramid, and you can map different assessment strategies to whereabouts on Miller's pyramid you want to be assessing. So with multi-source feedback, workplace-based assessments, they're very much the in vivo performance, somebody actually showing what they do. OSCEs, SJTs are in vitro assessments of performance, where somebody can show it in a slightly artificial environment. And then the knowledge, the knowing how and the knows, very much around the things like the single best answer. So we've thought a little bit about different assessment strategies. I'm going to focus on the OSCE and think a little bit about station-based examinations. So these take place in a slightly artificial context generally. They're assessing against skills as their primary objective, and thinking a little bit about what these would normally look like. So just reviewing with you stuff you may be familiar with about OSCEs before we apply it to the e-assessment kind of strategies. So some basic principles when you're designing an OSCE, remembering this is assessment of skills in vitro in a simulated environment. So for this process to work, what you want to do is you take your learning outcomes and you work out using a blueprint a core selection of stations, and you're normally sampling from about 9, 10, 12 stations. You don't have to make them a standard length, but realistically, to put a circuit together, you need a fairly standard length of stations, and you can assess communication skills, practical skills. You can also assess application of knowledge, interpretation of investigations, as well as clinical examination skills. One of the key elements as an examiner is when you're designing these assessments is you need to break down the skill into all of its component parts, and then you have to score each part, and you can either do each individual section, or there's a move to what's called domain marking, where you just get the assessor to give a broad overview of how were their communication, how was their reasoning, how were their examination skills. That works well if you've got very experienced examiners who essentially have their own checklist that they're working through subconsciously. And then you need a global score of the candidate's total performance, because you're going to need that for your standard setting, which I'll illustrate. So you need to break down into the component parts, and this needs to link to the learning resources that you give your students. You don't want to be assessing against something which is new. So your students should have had the opportunity to learn these things before. So your component part should be based on your student resources. Each component part is scored. This example is each individual component is given a score. As I say, if you were doing domain marking, you might ask more broadly, give the guidance, but group together 5 or 6 of these into an individual domain. And then the next thing you want to do is to get the assessor to use their global expertise to score the candidate. And we would use a scale that had excellent, good, pass, borderline, and fail. Although realistically, the key thing that you want to identify in an OSCE is your borderline candidates, because the way that standard setting works in an OSCE is to use what's called the borderline group or borderline regression analysis. And for that, you need your borderline candidates. For those of you not familiar with borderline group, this is how it works. So you start with your checklist and you get your examiner to tick the things that they've done, and you come up with a total. And what you do is you plot out that total on your test score distribution for all of your candidates. What you want to then do is to work out every candidate who scored borderline, you map out on a separate distribution. and you take the mean of the borderline candidates. So your examiners are identifying somebody they're just not sure about globally in terms of their performance, and working out where they would score those borderline candidates. So you take all of your assessor's expertise and you find the midpoint, and that becomes your passing score for your whole test score distribution. So that's what's called the borderline group method. And normally for an OSCE, this is what it ends up looking like, a complicated map that candidates work around, that requires a large number of examiners to be physically present in a building with clocks, with timers, so that somebody can go around a circuit. And so how did that then translate into online assessment? When COVID hit, what kind of things did we have to do in these kind of OSCE station-based exams? Well, what we did locally was we moved this, and I've worked both in Cambridge and in Nottingham in the UK developing these assessments. We moved this whole process to remote platforms. In Cambridge, we used a Zoom-based platform. In Nottingham, we used Microsoft Teams. There's a variety of strategies that you can use to do this. And so the way that it works is you run a bit like we're doing today, a large main section, which is where everybody sits. And then you put people into breakout groups with simulated patients, with assessors, and with the students. And we've done communication skills like this. We've done applied knowledge with interpretation of the images. We've done diagnostic reasoning. We've shown videos of examination findings. So that a variety of ways that we have done this. We've had challenges. It's difficult because you've got the patients, or the simulated patients are at home, so it's dependent on their technology. As the assessor, you've then got to link your findings with those simulated patients. So as the examiner, you're doing multiple things at the same time. And in Nottingham, we worked around that by having an administrator who was adding things in at different times. You require significant IT expertise to control the breakout rooms, and there are different ways that you can set up. Examiners were then at home, and that links into how does that impact in terms of your perceptions, in terms of potentially your biases. You might need more than one screen in order to do this, and that again raises technological challenges. The technology breaks down. In both Cambridge and Nottingham, we've been in situations where the technology stopped working, so you need a notebook and pen, so you've got a bit of a contingency plan. And that means you need more space in terms of the timings. So you end up running these assessments over a longer period of time to allow for technology problems, to allow for people moving in and out of rooms, and how you time the stations varies. So again, one option is to do it as we did it in Nottingham, which is where there is an external controller of the timings. In Cambridge, we had the examiners themselves within the station doing the timings, and we allowed them about 20 minutes to do a 10-minute station, so that it allowed flexibilities for breakdown in the technology and things as we went through. A bit like you've been highlighting, it's difficult in terms of students if they're at home. It's not always the case they've got adequate bandwidth that they can do this. The home environment is different to the work environment, and actually how you think in a work environment is different, and it's linked with the whole educational literature on tacit knowledge, which really requires you to be immersed in a specific environment. And so, as I highlighted earlier, sometimes we had to get students to come into rooms that were set up within our school, so that they could use the technology in the school, and then we had the socially distanced requirements that link with that. So we've tried these kind of models, and they're not entirely straightforward, but they have worked, and we have been able to produce valid and reliable assessments, but not without difficulties. That was at the height last year in terms of COVID. In terms of our clinical examinations, we've moved that and developed a more hybrid model for the practical elements, and that sort of links in with some of the challenges that the dental team were describing at Peradeniya, the difficulties of assessing practical skills. And so we've had to think about how we do that back face to face with social distancing requirements, which is a different subject to what we're discussing this afternoon. Finally, I'd just like to show you what we call the multiple mini interview, just as an example as to how this works, and pick up some of the security kind of issues as well that you highlighted earlier. So just to give you an idea how the MMI process works, so this is multiple mini interviews, and it's a station-based approach that enables you to discuss with any individual candidate about 9 different skill areas in order to narrow down to a certain number of places on our course. So we have between 500 and 600 candidates who would apply to our program. And we only have 41 places. So we have to narrow that down. And some of that is done by shortlisting of written applications, which is also done online and could be considered as a sort of e-assessment strategy. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus more on the station-based interview, where we invite 90 students to come along and we put them through a multiple station-based exam, which will be of more relevance to the kind of things that we'll all be doing with clinical exams. Picking up on earlier discussions with Gominda, so we have a blueprint. This is our blueprint. I don't expect you to read the details on this slide, but we blueprint against some national things in terms of the General Medical Council around the NHS requirements. And we have 9 core domains that we identify within our blueprint that we utilize when we're planning our exam, coming back to what are we trying to do. So we're trying to do a summative assessment, largely of skills. And so we're looking at applied knowledge skills, problem solving skills, and communication skills. And then we're looking at some of the professional attitudes, things like team working and professionalism. So the way we run this is we have 8 5-minute stations when we do this face-to-face, or did this face-to-face, looking at skills, looking at different aspects of being a doctor mapped to these various requirements. And we inform all the candidates that this is how we're going to do this. And so normally we then create these stations and we map those to our blueprint. And so this would be of relevance to any kind of station-based examination. You would go through this similar process of aligning your assessment with your learning outcomes by looking at your blueprint. And so this is how we would normally do it face-to-face, and we would use that kind of map. We have a couple of preparation stations and rest stations, and all our stations are a very standard time, something that will be familiar to any of you who run OSCE-based, station-based examinations. And we run these as a series of circuits. We moved this online. We used Zoom for the multiple mini interview kind of approach. So we used exactly the same blueprinting. So we didn't change our blueprint. We didn't change the mapping of the stations. So we redesigned our stations to ensure that they mapped exactly to the same learning outcomes and the same blueprinting. And we decided that we'd use interviewers controlling the station timing. So each candidate would start off in a big group like we are here, and we would direct them into their breakout group, and we left the interviewer in the breakout room, and the interviewer was given an MP3 file that had the station timings on it. So as soon as the candidate arrived in the breakout room, the examiner, the interviewer, would start their timer, and they controlled the timing within the station. We were able to slow the assessment down if there was a breakdown in that process, or if there were technology issues, by having a bit more flexibility in timing. And one of the key lessons I would take from the experience is the importance of needing a little bit more time to allow for technological challenges, because we kept running into those. So 5 minutes in each station. At the end of a station, we briefed our students to leave the breakout room when they were instructed via the announcement on the MP3 file, and they wouldn't leave the whole meeting. They would just come back into the main section where we would be, where we were overseeing, and we could go in and out of stations to check when there were technical kind of problems. So they had to leave the breakout room, not leave the meeting. We were very clear with them. earlier, people identified that there's a problem with people being somebody else. And we were very aware of that in an interview process where we don't actually know the candidates because they're not our students. And so we required each candidate to email us beforehand a copy of their passport or driving license. They had to then present it at the start of every station that they did, both to us and to the interviewers within the station. And we could cross-check that against the image that we already had, and obviously the image of them because we had their photograph. So I would entirely agree with some of the concerns and barriers that were raised in your small group around identification of candidates. This is the approach. It's not foolproof, but we had to implement something. We used a particular tool for marking called Mmi Progress. So rather than using paper, we had an electronic marking scheme, which is, as I say, called Mmi Progress. And this is what that looked like. So as the interviewer, we use domain marking in this case, although we gave them guidance as to what the domains might look like. And we might pick that up with Mathy in a little bit when we look at how this works on PACES for MRCP. So you get your marking scheme and you complete that using a separate online system, which is then recorded in a secure portal behind a firewall where we can see what's going on. Then the advantage of that is we could see this in real time. So we could pick up where people were missing things or where people were uncertain. So what we found with the MMI is, whereas historically our 90 candidates would travel from all around Europe to come and attend the interviews, this actually worked very well online. The interviewers preferred the setup when we got it up and running. It enabled us to check things like security quite well, and we produced very good results with less environmental impact because we significantly reduced the travel side of things. I think we're doing it again this year, even though we could do this face-to-face because it was so successful. I think it's going to remain an ongoing challenge in terms of the technology, because again, as was highlighted by yourselves earlier, is it reasonable to assume everybody's got access to technology? And actually, sometimes we might need to help people with the technology to ensure they've got the bandwidth so that they can perform adequately. So that's just a brief review of assessment methodologies, a brief review of online assessments, particularly looking at OSCEs, a bit about our experiences and lessons learned, which hopefully links with some of the things that you raised earlier, and an example of a station-based assessment that we've done remotely that used to be done face-to-face that worked well, just to give you an example to just trigger your thinking. So that's all that I wanted to cover in this session. We've got a couple of minutes if we've got any burning questions before we have a look at another station-based examination, which is the MRCP PACES exam. So Gominda, I don't know whether you wanted to chair the discussions here, whether people have got stuff that they'd like to share within the chat.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very, very insightful presentation, because that gave us a lot of insight into, I mean, no matter where it is, technology is a problem that you need to find ways out of it.
Yeah. And as educators, it's a new challenge. And I would say it is a lot of work, and I'm not particularly savvy with IT, and it requires you pulling in a team of people who can do the IT. But the positive side of this has been actually what's been put together with input from our IT specialists and things actually works well. And, you know, I would have never said 2 years ago that we'd be doing all of this online out of choice another time. So it's a
Mark, if I slightly twist this situation, what I gathered is that this MMI is basically type of an interview where there was no hands-on skills involved. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. People liked doing it face-to-face because you could ask people to do problem solving and things. But actually, if you think a little bit imaginatively, you can translate that online. What we didn't have was the kind of things that were highlighted earlier by Chancellor from Peradeniya. We weren't expecting people to do things on a mannequin or, demonstrate practical procedures. And that has been a challenge. I say that's been a slightly different challenge as to how you do that, utilizing social distancing, which is slightly beyond the remit of this this afternoon's discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. It's because I think some of maybe the participants would be interested to know is whether you, not in this context, but maybe in the medical school, whether you tried out actual physical examination stations online, or whether you think of, have you thought of doing it that way?
We used videos and things for physical consultation in terms of when we were completely unable to do face-to-face, but we have moved now. What we use is we use simulated patients, and with the simulated patients, we have one student who has the same simulated patient in a room, and the examiner moves around, and each simulated patient gets examined for different systems, and the examiner brings with them equipment for particular things. So if it was a cardiovascular exam, etc., then it would the examiner would bring an ECG and or a recording of heart sounds to the assessment.
Okay, thank you. That helps a lot. I mean, that's quite innovative in the sense. I mean, that's a classic example of sort of making use of what is available and doing it in the best possible way.
Yes, yeah. And I think the key thing is about flexibility.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't know whether there are questions from the others. I think in the absence of probably any question, probably you can move on to the next session.
Yep.
I think, Geeta, you have posted.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Madhi, it's next one is yours regarding the communication skill assessment. To those who are participating, I have posted a link in your chat box. If you have a look at the link, that is the details of the patient that we are going to discuss in the communication scenario. Over to you, Madhi.
Right, Geeta, thank you for this kind invitation. It is great to see very enthusiastic crowd participating in the medical seminar so far. I'm really enjoying this session. And I know that we are in two different time zones, and whatever the time zones we are in, I would like to extend a very warm virtual welcome to you all. I also would like to thank the organizing committee for this kind invitation. Little is more gratifying than actually being invited to talk in your hometown, albeit virtually. I have had several difficulties in my life, but to follow such class act like Mark and Gominda, it's not an easy task. They both come with wealth of experience, tremendous credibility, and also great enthusiasm and effort for medical education. And I like to thank you, particularly Mark, for taking time to join on this medical education seminar. Okay. So those of you who don't know me, I am, as Geeta said, I'm Mathialagan. I'm one of the consultant physician gastroenterologists based in southeast of England, Norfolk. But more importantly, I qualified in University of Jaffna in 1986. And UK is the place I live and work, but Jaffna is the place my heart lies. And I would like to dedicate this lecture to all my teachers and colleagues who brought abundance of enthusiasm and energy during our time over in Jaffna. For the purpose of this talk, I would like to say some conflict of interest. I have been involved with the MRCP PACES for the past 20 years or so. And I'm a chair of examiners both in the UK and overseas. And I was particularly involved in the discussion and development of the post-COVID secure PACES, which is the main topic that we'll be talking about. And I also host exam on a regular basis. I know that participants here perhaps may not be familiar with the PACES exam. I thought it would be useful to give you a bit of historical perspective. And the Royal College of Physicians was funded nearly 500 years ago, and it received the Royal Charter, Henry the King VIII. And in fact, the RCP celebrated its 500 years of quincentennial celebration a few years back. And this is where the home of the RCP London. It's been there for the past 6 years or so. Just to give you a brief summary of the PACES exam, as you can see, it was started long time ago, but it is an exam which tests your knowledge base, especially in clinical as well as in communication skills. And it plays an important part in the educational experience of postgraduate trainees who choose to do medicine as a career in various subspecialties. And it is relevant to people both in the UK and also other parts of the world. And it is an important exam for equal valid and relevant in many countries. Just to show you that this exam is held over 40 countries. About 2,000 places is overseas, so candidates take the exam. I think it is fair to say this exam perhaps it informs you more than it tests you in that context. So PACES exam stands for a practical assessment of clinical and communication skills. And just to show you the pre-COVID, the PACES carousel, there are 5 stations, some clinical stations and some communication skill stations. Clinical stations are done face-to-face or in person, but the communication skill station is 2 and 4. That is done virtually after the post-COVID. Each station has got 20 minutes and marked independently by 2 examiners. So the candidate will go through the carousel of all 5 stations. It takes about 120 minutes, and they would be seen by 10 examiners. So it perhaps gives you a much better representation rather than in the past, 2 examiners were assessing you and making decisions. And this is an exam, but as you can imagine, a high-stake exam. Candidate obviously quite nervous and anxious because this is, I would say, if you want to specialize in hospital medicine, either where in the UK or some of the outside Indian subcontinent, you need to pass this exam to progress into your hospital specialty. So the past 2 years, and I don't have to tell this audience, it has been very challenging and unprecedented like no other years. And this also has brought let me just, So it has also brought enormous challenges to our personal, professional, and social life. But this unprecedented pandemic has also given us opportunity to do things differently. That is what we've been talking about, e-assessment and how we assess the communication skills. the rapid adaptation of remote consultation, of telemedicine, virtual consultation, and digital aspect and communication skill assessment has been one of the most notable changes that COVID has brought upon healthcare worldwide. So as I mentioned that for the post-COVID, the initial carousel was split into two mini carousel. The one on your left is the clinical stations 1, 3, and 5 that is done face-to-face. The one we have started doing was the virtual or remote assessment is the communication skill exams. And the station 2 is you must be able to take a systematic and thorough history and identify patient concern and agree on management plan. This scenario is designed basically to test the candidates, the breadth and the depth of knowledge. Generally, it has got more than one differential diagnosis, and it is a complex problem. Whereas station 4 is all about ethical issues and communication skills. The emphasis is not on your clinical knowledge. For example, things like breaking bad news or delayed or misdiagnosis, medication errors, complication following a procedure, how to tackle a patient with the feeding and a DNA CPR decisions, patient refusing treatment or failed discharge. Those are the sort of type of scenarios which would be tested in this station 4. And that is the area that we would like to have a mock session later on, perhaps in a few minutes. So what it involves, this communication skills virtual assessment, there are 3 parts. The part which the candidate is given to read, they have 5 minutes of reading time. And that I think it kindly shared this information. I hope that you would be able to read that a bit of candidate information. The other one is the information that written to surrogate so that they would be able to tell the scenario and talk to the candidate and respond to their questions in a way that we would like to test. As I said, normally there's a rehearsal with the surrogate takes place, what we call a calibration. That takes about 30 to 45 minutes, which is an essential part of this assessment. And then the examiner is also given what sort of criteria and the skills that we are testing to make sure that candidates achieve those marks. So examiners are given every detail. In fact, to be honest, being an examiner in MRCP is not a difficult task that all the informations are given. So I just wanted to show you before we start the mock exam, the RCP, the Royal College of Physicians, looked at the Pesos Exam data, and they found the overseas doctors, people trained outside the UK, the pass rate is about 40 to 45%, whereas the pass rate for the local graduates in the UK is about 60 to 65%. And then when they looked at the results, why the candidates are failing from overseas centers, mainly because of the communication skills. That people do fail on the communication, but they do well on the clinical examination bit. And that again highlights the perhaps how the medical education or the curriculum takes place in each country. And whereas locally in the UK, the candidates fail because of fail to identify the physical signs. I think the word craft or the on-the-job learning is something it is becoming more limited. And in fact, it's have been a problem with the COVID as well, where they couldn't actually come to ward to see patients face-to-face. And hopefully that all will change. And this is something that I think Mark and Jeremy talked about in the past, to explore the cultural and linguistic influences, how that influence as the overseas candidate. Because it's not easy, and also it's unreasonable to expect someone to travel halfway through across the world and land in a different social and clinical environment and have a different social modes and language and unexpected to settle in quickly. So it takes time. Just to give you some few examples, when you talk to patients they will talk about, I'm not feeling well, I'm feeling under the weather. That is a sort of description or the terminology the overseas doctors may not be familiar with. And also with the local sort of patients describe that I'm not sure that I'm not being able to eat well, I'm not sleeping. Perhaps they are describing some symptoms with depression, and that also the overseas candidate may not be related to the ability to detect cues. And also, more interestingly, when patients talk about that I'm having some water work problem, it is about the urinary symptoms, and that is a colloquial term is very much used in the UK. And the overseas candidates, I remember someone said that he or she thought the patient is having some water leakage problem at home, that's why he came to hospital. And equally, and I was told that when they took a social history, well, the patient said that I live in a terraced house, but the candidate thought he's living in a terrorist house, and that is why the patient had to be admitted. So I'm just highlighting some of the things where that the cultural and linguistic influences can play a part when it's come for assessment. We talked about that, and as you know, this is something that what the British thinks and what they say is something that people talk about. I just would like to highlight a couple of things. With the greatest respect is something that you will hear often, and I think the person outside the UK will think that he is listening to my point, but actually what it means is I think you are an idiot. So these are some of the things it takes time for people to understand and then to familiarize. So this is one of those things that I want to highlight. This is the skill that I find the overseas trainees tend to fail or achieve correct mark. That is the managing patient concerns. This is an area I think that needs a particular consideration. And when we talk to the trainees, this is something that we make sure that they understand. The main thing that we find is not exploring the patient's concern in enough detail, not addressing the patient's concern in a satisfactory manner, not listening to the patient. That perhaps not an issue. It is probably an issue across the whole spectrum, whether you are practicing in the UK, outside, and talking over the patient, not checking that the patient related understand that what you have discussed. Those are some of the things we find that perhaps need highlighting. And as doctors, we know the interactions that we have with our patients are a crucial part of the medical care we provide. Our empathy and professionalism shape a patient's experience almost as much as our diagnostic abilities and surgical skills. So it is important that I think the experienced clinician will tell you the medicine is about 75% is about reassurance. Another 10-15% is about modifying lifestyle. Only about 10% of the time that you have to actually intervene in terms of so it is all about how you communicate to provide the reassurance and everything else. Right. So the next bit we have planned for a mock station 4 communication skills. We have got a surrogate and also a candidate, and hope the system work. And in this scenario, we have shared the information that you need to know. The candidate gets 14 minutes with the surrogate to discuss about the scenario that's been written, and they get 1 minute to reflect or collect their thoughts, and then they have a 5-minute discussion with the examiners about that particular station to assess the skill. The skill we are assessing in this station 4 is the communication skills, whether they are able to communicate clearly in a structured manner, and not using medical jargons and explaining to the relative or the patient in a way that they are able to understand. Also, we are making assessment on their judgment, whether they're able to make an appropriate judgment, seek and acknowledge the concerns they have, and that is another skill that we are assessing. And the other skill that we are assessing is skill A, addressing patient concern, which we talked about just before on my previous slide. And the other skill, the final skill we are assessing is skill G, which is the patient welfare, and also respectfully, and to make sure their dignity and safety and the comfort is maintained throughout the discussion. So those are the 4 skills that we are assessing in this mock station. And let me stop share and introduce our surrogate and the candidate. I think, yes, I can see Nicholas Kerman. He's our medical equipment librarian who kindly agreed to play this scenario for us. And Dr. Alcock, he's joining from us, not from our hospital. He used to be our special registrar. Now he moved to Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, and he is on childcare duty this morning. He recently had a twin, but he also managed to take time to come and join us. I'm very grateful to both Christian and Nick for taking time to join. So before we start, I hope Christian and Nichols, you have taken, unmute your button. Any questions or comments before we start the mock session?
Okay, no problem.
From audience over in Sri Lanka, any comments or questions?
I don't think so, Madhi, you can carry on.
Okay, perfect. So now, Christian, you have got 14 minutes with Nick, and I thought you have had a chance to read the material, so we don't need to give you 5 minutes, if that's okay. So your time, sorry, Christian, you said something.
That's absolutely fine.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, will you do is there a 2-minute warning after 12 minutes, or are we just going straight through to 14 minutes?
No, I will give you a 2 minutes warning at 12 minutes, Nick. So your time starts now. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. My name's Christian. I'm one of the doctors on the ward. Is it Mr. Nick Foote? Yeah. Hello. Morning, doctor. Morning. Hi there. I'm one of the doctors looking after your son James, and I understand that you wanted to have a chat about how he is and what's been going on. Yeah, definitely. I'm not very happy, to be honest, doctor, because last time I saw him, he was in ITU last night. Nobody told me that they were going to move him. So I went to ITU this morning, talked to the doctors there, had the shock of my life, didn't see him in the bed. Yeah. Why didn't anybody ring me to tell me they'd moved him? So I'm so sorry. I'm certainly not very happy with that. Why can't they tell us what's happened? All they kept saying was they didn't have his notes. They're not his doctor anymore, and I need to speak to you. I've hardly had any sleep. I'm not in a very good mood, doctor. I'll warn you now. I'm really sorry. I can tell you, I'm sorry for what's happened. I can tell you, I do have his notes. I am his doctor. I'm here to answer your questions. Now, yeah. Yeah. What have you been able to glean so far? What's gotten through the haze? Very little. They're hardly telling me anything. James is not telling me anything. All he said to me this morning was he's fine, nothing to worry about. He'll be all right. He's fine. He's fine. You know, crikey, your son goes out for a party. You know, ends up in A&E, then goes to ITU. I think he was on a ventilator. I'm not sure. But yeah, he's had some sort of seizures, 2 or 3 seizures, I think they've said, you know, but other than that, nobody's telling me anything. So you're absolutely right. He has had a seizure. He was out, he had a seizure, he went up to ITU. The nature of seizures is that, yes. So we counted as 1 episode, but there were 3 distinct seizures that he'd had. And because of the nature of them, they do come on very quickly and they affect the body very dramatically, but they also can resolve very quickly. And when you say that, I mean, quickly, crikey, when somebody's on a ventilator in ITU one time, and then a few hours later is just moved to an ordinary ward, to me, that just doesn't seem possible. I don't know, epilepsy or something, is it? So if we take a step back and start with seizures, presumably a term that you've heard before, what do you know about seizures? What's been told to you?
Epilepsy. I know we haven't got it in the family. I've never heard of anybody in the family having epilepsy. He's never suffered with epilepsy before.
Sure.
But it, you know.
Yep. So a seizure is a sudden onset, uncontrolled electrical surge in the brain, which can have a whole range of effects on the body, from the very Hollywood big arms shaking and frothing at the mouth to very mild impacts on people becoming sort of unaware and vague. So that's what a seizure is.
He must have been pretty bad. I mean, I don't want to keep interrupting you, but he must have been pretty bad to be ventilated, you know.
He was in that state where he needed support with his breathing, because, as we say, there's a big surge of electrical activity in the brain, and with James, it affected all of his muscles, including the muscles associated with his breathing. So about at least 2% of the population will have a seizure. Any single one of us in the world can have a seizure, and we can bring it on in people. So everyone has that.
What this is what nobody's telling me. Nobody's telling me what's caused it. If it's going to happen again, you know, is he going to be sort of rushed in again? What?
Really good questions. Okay, so like I say, medically we can actually bring on a seizure in anyone. So each and every single one of us have a level of things that we can put up with in our bodies and our minds, beyond which we will have a seizure. That's true for every single one of us. Okay. Now, some things push us closer and closer and above that level, and lots of really common things like blood sugar, dehydration, different salt levels, alcohol, prescribed medications, a whole range of things. List as long as your arm. And
but that's what's. I mean, he has been, and I've tried to talk to him about this, to be honest. He has been drinking a hell of a lot of alcohol lately. So are you telling me that, because he doesn't want to tell me anything, I've been trying to talk to him. Is it the alcohol then that's caused him to have a seizure?
So when it comes to seizures, we often don't see just one thing that causes the whole thing. It's often a mix of where each individual level's at and the number of factors that push them towards that level. Okay, so alcohol is on the list. It does push you closer to having a seizure. But while he's here, he's had a scan of his brain to make sure there's nothing inside of the brain to trigger seizures. And I'm happy to tell you that that's come back as absolutely normal. And things like hydration, salts, we're doing a number of blood tests to make sure infections are really, really common for pushing people up towards that level. So we'll be doing a number of investigations while he's here.
Do you really know what's caused it then? Are we?
So like I say, it's not about there being a single cause. It's about a mix of where he's at and everything that's gone on in his day, his week, his month to push him towards that level. And what our job is to pick up on every single thing that's pushing him closer to that level and fix it wherever we can. So we're not looking for a single cause. We're looking very broadly and trying to help him across the board.
Okay, and if so, is it likely to happen again? That's because he works. He's just had he's got a job as a van driver, and I know because I was talking to people this morning on the phone that our friends and stuff and they were saying like once you've had a seizure, you're not going to be able to work, especially as a van or drive. Put it that way. Is that something?
So there is an impact on driving. Okay. So if I can, I'll come and answer this question directly. I think it's important to answer another question that you asked, which was about epilepsy and the difference between a seizure and epilepsy, which is how to understand whether this will happen again. So epilepsy is when that threshold for having a seizure is so low that it happens in day-to-day life without having something provoking it. Okay. We don't diagnose epilepsy after a single seizure, so we're not giving him a diagnosis of epilepsy today. and we're hoping
So
that
then no.
So some people, people who have epilepsy will have a first seizure, but not everyone who has a first seizure will go on to have further ones. Okay, so we don't know at the moment. It's about at this stage. It's about giving James advice about all the things that can push him closer to that level, and enabling him and helping him to identify these and try and minimize his risks across the board. So good health, hydration.
So if it happens again, it's epilepsy. If it doesn't happen again, he's just drunk too much alcohol.
So after the second or third seizure, if we can't find something pattern to it that's provoking it, then that's when we consider the diagnosis of epilepsy.
So you're going to have a few more seizures before you can diagnose him properly.
Before we can confidently say that this is epilepsy and not just a one-off, then yes, that's the typical path.
What about as if this is epilepsy? Should other people get tested? I mean, he's got a slightly younger sister. Should she need to? She's just started. She's just started driving lessons, so whether she needs to,
So there's no. Some families do have epilepsy, but there are many families who will just have one epileptic in the family, and there's not a single test in the absence of seizures that can lead us to that diagnosis, if that makes sense. So it's very much based on the clinical picture of there being seizures that someone's suffering with. But going forward from this hospital admission, we will refer James to the first seizure clinic, where he will see a neurologist and start being under their care. Yep.
What does he do? I mean, as far as his work is concerned,
2 minutes left.
He's a van driver.
He's a van driver.
He loves the job. So he's really struggled to get a job, and I mean, can he just carry on with that?
So there are laws that we can't navigate, for want of a better term, and the law is very clear that driving has to stop for a period of time, and that period of time is 6 months. Okay.
So it's to stop driving.
To stop driving for 6 months and to inform the DVLA. There are things that we can do to help James with his employment.
If you're saying it's his drinking that's caused this seizure, if you tell him to stop drinking, surely that'll be fine, won't it? He doesn't have to.
So, like, I'll bring you back to our discussion about seizures. Is that we're not looking at a picture where there's one single cause, and we don't know where his seizure level is at in terms of his day-to-day life.
This isn't something that's in the family or affect, like I say, his sister. And he had a little baby brother. We had a baby a few years back, sort of unexpected, if you like. But he died. David died quite. Nothing. I'm sort of worrying that maybe my head's spinning a bit. Worrying that this could be something like a family, something that runs in families, because they said it was a cot death, but I don't know. Sorry, that sounds absolutely awful, and I'm guessing that they didn't get to the bottom of it at the time. Really, I'm really sorry. Seizures are a small but significant cause of sudden infant death syndrome. But like I say, at this stage, we're moving forward with James as a first seizure. We'll have him under the care of neurology going forward, and keep a really close eye on him. And if things start going in the wrong direction in terms of his seizures, then we'll consider the diagnosis of epilepsy and support you as a family going forward.
Okay, Christian, your time is up. You've got 1 minute to collect your thoughts. Nick, thank you. Right, Christian, we have got 5 minutes. My co-examiner is Dr. Mark Lilicrap. He's based in Cambridge. Usually in the exam situation, only one examiner will lead the question, but it will be marked by 2 examiners independently. Mark, you happy to lead the questions, or do you want me to?
Do you want to lead the questions, Matthew? Because you're the one with much more experience of this particular exam, so probably more appropriate for you to lead on them.
Okay, no worries. So, Christian, what are the factors that you took into consideration when explaining this particular incident to the father? What were the guiding principles that you had?
So the guiding ethical principles would be that of autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and social justice. Autonomy in terms of the patient's right to confidentiality. Non-maleficence, Nick was very concerned about the impact on his family, and that we wouldn't be missing something or withholding information that may bar them from having investigation. But also beneficence, I'm sure it'd be very reassuring if we disclose some of the details of that night, and he could reassure himself that that the family risk was somewhat lower. And then there's the idea of social justice. So looking a bit more broadly, making sure that people who've had a seizure aren't on the road where they can have a seizure behind the wheel of a car and cause wider social damage.
So why do you think, Christian, that obviously the father understandably was worried the reason for the fits, and certainly I understand the son didn't want. When will you think that you perhaps will consider whether father needs to be informed, if you feel there is circumstances where you need to consider that?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that? In terms of divulging all of the information of the night's events, or?
Correct. Yes. When would you think that it's your duty that you may have to inform the father, though perhaps the son didn't want you to?
So in terms of informing the father, I would say only at the point where the patient loses capacity to make the decision, and we need to divulge information in the patient's best interest, such as if he didn't come round from his episode in ITU and he was still sedated and ventilated, and some decisions regarding his care needed to be made by the next of kin. Divulging information in this scenario also involves the DVLA, and we would first try and encourage and empower people to go to the DVLA themselves. However, if it was clear that they continued to drive, didn't inform the DVLA or surrender their license for 6 months, we would have a duty to divulge that to the appropriate agency. But at the same time, informing the patient who has their information and what information they hold.
Right. Thank you. Was worried and he was angry and upset about what happened with the admission. And do you think that you were able to reassure him that was the right thing to do?
I'm very happy to apologise for the workings of the hospital, and I think it would be, in an ideal world, we should be telling people when they move from ward to ward. And I think that if he remains angry after his other concerns were addressed, I would very happily direct him to the patient advice and liaison service to open up some communication channels and try and get some further explanations about what's been going on with his son's admission.
Right, good. Okay, Christian, I think that is where our 5 minute discussion ends. But thank you for once again demonstrating so beautifully some of the elements that we are going to discuss. Feel free to, Christian, if you are around, to come in and sort of talk about it. But if you are busy, I can understand that if you want to resume your child care duties. But it would be good if you are able to stay in and to talk about your experience. So just open.
I'm sorry, Dr. Matty, I've got to leave, but thank you very much.
Okay, no, that's very kind. Thank you very much, Christian. I appreciate it. Thank you. Right. Okay, good. So this it is open for general discussion now. And as I mentioned, this particular scenario is about ethics and communication when we have a difficult or unhappy, or generally there's something went wrong, or there are certain things that you want to break bad news, explaining the patients in a way that avoiding medical jargon. So a lot of things that being tested. So you can see it wasn't an easy conversation, but there was some principle I thought the Christian did very well. Before we come to that, I just wonder, Mark and someone else, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So first of all, I just step back and this is very much how it feels doing an e-assessment. And actually the experience of just watching Nick and Christian doing that consultation is very much how it feels when I've done these on both Zoom and Microsoft Teams. It's a different, you feel differently as an examiner because you've got that separation. And I think that links into something that was raised earlier about bias. Do you think differently when you're in this kind of environment? So I think it's very true to life. As I'm sure you feel that way as well, Matthew, in terms of having done PACES like this. Well, it may seem like this is exactly very much how it feels.
You're right. When we started this after post-COVID, because as you know that we didn't want to bring too many examiners and the candidate and patients, so that to try and avoid the minimum contact. So they thought the virtual exam would be doable. But having done this for the past year and a half or so, I feel if the technology works and if the people are familiar with the system, I think this is as good as face-to-face assessment. In fact, it works well, as you said, for the right reasons. The examiners can be remotely wherever they are. They don't need to be on site on the exam venue. You have a surrogate who can join in from their home place. So it is quite flexible and versatile and easy to administer exams. And also you can have a large pool of examiners who have to take time off due to family reasons or work commitments. So it works well for this station 2 and 4. But where we have got it difficulty, I suppose, is when the technology fails. When the particular, when people are not very familiar with, the images can froze very quickly. We find that's a problem. And the computer screen sometimes also need to be restarted. So some of those issues that we had. But overall, it's good. I would say it's working very well.
So what I would suggest we get everybody to do at this point, we haven't actually given you a mark sheet, but I will talk you through what the MRCP PACES mark sheet looks like. If you look on the page 2 of the information that linked through, there were 4 domains that you would be required to mark as an examiner on MRCP PACES, and you have to mark each one. There are 3 options. So a bit like I discussed with the MMI. So you have satisfactory, borderline, or unsatisfactory. And what I would suggest that you do is on a blank sheet of paper, draw out a grid with down the left-hand side, I would write communication skills, managing patient concerns, clinical judgment, maintaining patient welfare and ethics. And Mark, I would,
I was telling Mark, unfortunately, the link which we sent is only the first bit of the candidate information. I haven't sent the surrogate,
but that's fine. If we just get people to write this down on a sheet of paper, it'll be, so they're your 4 domains that you want to be thinking about. So we've got communication skills, management of the patient concerns, clinical judgment, and maintaining patient welfare and ethics. So they're your 4 parts. So they're your 4 domains. And I'm going to talk you through the sub bits within those domains that will help your marking. But you're going to have to score each of those, thinking back to Christian's performance, as either satisfactory, borderline, or unsatisfactory. So if we look at the first line, that's clinical communication skills. A satisfactory candidate for clinical communication skills will have explained the relevant clinical information in an accurate, clear, and well-structured way that was fluent and looked professional. An unsatisfactory candidate will have given inaccurate information or unclear information, used medical jargon, looked unpracticed, and doesn't look slick. So they are unsatisfactory. And a borderline candidate is the one, I'm just not sure how this person's performing. So have a think just for a moment, how would you score Christian on his clinical communication skills here? And is there anything you would comment on? The second line is managing the patient concerns. So a satisfactory candidate would have listened to the concerns, seek and acknowledge any of the concerns, confirm that they've understood them and shown empathy. An unsatisfactory candidate will not have listened adequately to the concerns, to overlook concerns, not show empathy, or doesn't check that they've understood things properly. Clinical judgment is about how you process that information and come up with decisions. So a satisfactory candidate will have identified and negotiated an appropriate management plan and applied their clinical knowledge, including their knowledge of ethics, to the case. An inappropriate or unsatisfactory candidate will have come up with an inappropriate or incomplete management plan and hasn't applied their clinical knowledge or their ethical knowledge appropriately to the case. And the final one is welfare and ethics, which is a satisfactory candidate will have treated the patient respectfully and sensitively, in this case, the relative, and ensured comfort, safety, and dignity. And the unsatisfactory candidate will have jeopardized patient safety in some way or have caused emotional discomfort. So they would be your boxes, and what you would as an examiner have to do is score those boxes. So I would just get you to do that scoring now. Does that sound fair, Matthew? Does that link in with how you would normally score?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a good exercise. Perhaps I should have sent the mark sheet. That would have been made the process much more easier. But it will be, I think, perhaps, we can talk about it in terms of the skills that particularly we were looking for. And also, it is true that unsatisfactory and satisfactory is a very sort of good way of marking. What we tend to recommend to avoid borderline, and the college feel there is no borderline examiners, only borderline candidate, only borderline examiner.
Yeah. So you're required to come off the fence very often within the college assessment system. So if I was looking as an examiner, just to give a bit of context here, you've frozen there, Matthew. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you've frozen there. I would definitely score him in satisfactory for his communication skills. I thought he explained the relevant clinical information very accurately. And he had a framework that he was utilizing in those discussions, which is what you're really looking for. I would probably be a bit concerned about how he dealt with the patient concerns. And I would be at risk of being a borderline examiner in this case, because I would have liked him to start off with more understanding of the patient or the relative's perspective. I would have wanted him to start with a question around, well, tell me a bit about your understanding of seizures and your understanding of epilepsy. He came in with quite a doctor-centric perspective right at the start. He didn't address the relative's concern. The relative had come up with a binary way of describing the problem. This was either epilepsy or alcohol. It was one or the other. And actually, he didn't acknowledge and look at the nuances of the patient's concerns in that situation. I thought his clinical judgment was very good. I thought his understanding of the ethics was very good. And I thought he did very well in terms of ensuring patient safety, particularly the concerns of the patient themselves, to not discuss recreational drug use within the context. So generally, I'd say this was satisfactory, but I would have concerns, an area of improvement around managing the patient's concerns and the patient perspective. How would you have reported on that one, Matthew? You're on mute there, Matthew.
So Mark, I was saying that, I agree with some of the points that you made about the patient, the concern, but it was difficult because the father started, he was angry and he was unhappy. The conversation didn't start as well as it could have been. But that is one of the problems, because if you have a proper actors and they sometimes overdo it, and that makes the candidates with a put off and they struggle. Though perhaps he didn't understand, as you said, the ideas and concerns and the expectation to start with, I would say overall, I would have passed him, Mark. I know that you are a difficult examiner, but I would have thought that he did reasonably well because he didn't use any medical jargons during explanation. He kept his calm. He was able to make sure that the father's voice was heard, and he's able to explain in a way. I thought then he was able to develop a bit of rapport. And also it's interesting when he was concerned about the relative's death, and he took time to acknowledge and also able to say those things are some of the things that I feel is important for when the candidate we assess. But I do agree, it didn't start off with a proper sort of initial, I do find, Mark, it is true when it comes to communication skill assessment, the first 2 minutes of where you introduce yourself appropriately, define the purpose of the interview, and define your role, if they can do that bit well and everything else flows well. Unfortunately, Nick didn't allow Christian to do that. But, it happens, that's real life.
But I would agree. I would want this man, Christian, to be a pass candidate. And I agree with you. I thought he dealt very well with the bereavement issues and acknowledged that element of it. And I thought that pulled him up a bit towards the end. I'm aware other people may have comments. So other people who've just watched that in that sort of mock examiner kind of role, does anybody else have things that they'd like to add in terms of how they felt about that? Things that they'd want to comment on?
Mark, this is Gominda again. I just want to pick your brains on this. Now this is an online conversation. So, so some of the things that we teach in communication skills, like eye contact, for example, they cannot be judged in the same way. Although I'm sure there is, you can see whether they are doing something, looking at somewhere else, or looking at the camera. You can judge that. But the eye-to-eye contact and some of the things which you traditionally see, especially not on the rating scales, but especially on checklists those days. I mean, classic example would be what you are very familiar with, that is Cambridge Calgary checklist, for example.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So with online assessment, some of those checklists and some of the things that we ask the examiner to look at will have to be redefined, I suppose.
Yes, and I think that's not just the case for assessment, though. I mean, certainly within the UK, a lot of our consultations are now taking place remotely. And these are skills that all of us are having to learn to translate into an online environment. So I think the MRCP PACES kind of setup is just, another way of assessing that's actually fairly true to life. in the way that we're doing some of our consultations. And I agree with you. Some of those non-verbal skills that are part of, if you go to the Cambridge Calgary model, maintaining the relationship and developing the relationship, how do we judge that? I think having watched a video or a consultation like that, you can see the way that Christian's interacting through his camera. And actually, I thought his non-verbal communication and the way that he was expressing that was actually quite good in terms of the approach that he took there. But I agree with you. It is a different way of consulting. And therefore, it has to be a different way of assessing.
Thank you.
If I could make a couple of points on that, Gominda, that you're right. Facial expression, body language, and gestures are important part of the communication. In fact, when you're breaking bad news, not only what you say and how you say it and how your expressions also is important for the relatives or the patient to know. You don't want to give false reassurance. Equally, you also don't want to be optimistic. So it's important, those measures. But the fact that now we're all wearing masks on our day-to-day work, that also take away the fact that they're not being able to see our facial expression. And also interestingly, but some cultural background, people do wear facial masks, and we have had exams in Middle East where they do come as a candidate where you won't be able to see. So though there is a limitation that makes it difficult, but that is only part of the assessment. But in the communication skills, they can take the mask off. We actually do tell the candidate they don't have to wear the mask when they are doing virtual consultation. So you can still able to see in terms of their body language. Yeah, I think you are right. That is a very important point in a day-to-day medical practice, how those gestures and the expressions are important as how you communicate.
So in a way, it's an advantage of this sort of e-assessment. It's an advantage because if it was face-to-face, they would be wearing masks.
Absolutely. I think this is what I think, Gominda, the purpose of this is that you are able to administer part of the exams virtually. It is less trouble for the college. The examiners, if you look at UK, 30% of the UK consultant workforce is female. I'm sure it is probably same in Sri Lanka as well. But most of the time, they're not being able to examine because they have got family commitments, children. They're not being able to take time to travel and examine. But now we were able to get all those people who are interested able to come on virtually and examine from their own comfort in their home sofa. And it's good. I would say perhaps this particular assessment, Mark mentioned about the medical admissions administrations are now held virtually. So I think those are the way forward. I think that's one of the good things perhaps come out of this COVID pandemic. We are all exploring and learning. In fact, less traveling and more time, it's quite cost effective, is all working well.
Excellent. I'm aware that it is 4:30. And so I think the plan was to, at this point, just open it back up to people to think a little bit more broadly again about e-assessment. I'm just going to reshare your thoughts from your earlier breakout room discussions. Gominda, I don't know whether you wanted to just do a bit of a review in terms of what we've covered during the course of this afternoon session and open it up for discussion from the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I think to me, I mean, it was as I can see on the chat. I think this was I would call an eye opener for many. Not so much those who have never sort of taken part in e-assessment. I think because of COVID, many have at least to an extent, being part of e-assessment at some point. In the cycle that I showed, at some stage we have been part of. But I think as we can see from the chats, I think this is an eye-opener in the sense that what are the possibilities? I think that's, to me, these sessions are eye-openers in that sense. We always get, when we discuss, we get more possibilities. So if I go through the entire program that we went through, probably what you show us here is the first task that the participants did, and they came up with a rich array of possibilities, advantages and disadvantages. So that was really a kickstart to everything. Then we looked at the overall assessment cycle and how technology can assist. Then Mark gave us some personal experiences with regard to MMI, and that would have given, I think, our participants quite a lot of insight into what can be done and how could it be done, including the technical details, such as the breakout rooms and not to leave the meeting, but to leave the breakout room and so on. And then Mathi showed us how it could be done in a summative exam, in a high-stakes summative exam. Of course, I mean, it's only maybe related to the medical interview, but still that would take off some of the stress and the burden that we may have to face, especially in a situation like this, where COVID is still not completely gone. So in this sense, probably, Mark, I think we addressed many of these. For example, if we can go through the user issues, technological limitations, bandwidth is not reliable, mindset in online learning, and bias of assessment. I think the limitations, the technical part apart. Now, I would like probably Mathi and Mark, both of you, to discuss now in that sort of a situation that you showed us. What would be the biases that you think that will that will play when you compare it with a face-to-face exam?
I mean, we all come with biases, and we all do. For those of you familiar with sort of dual process thinking, we all make very rapid decisions, and we do things. We often make decisions, and we know examiners make those decisions in those kind of assessments within the first 30 seconds of a consultation. That's the true face-to-face or remote. What we don't really know yet, and is an area that we're just going to have to learn as we go through, is how does the online environment change that rapid pattern recognition kind of approach that we take? How much are we subconsciously influenced by somebody's background? You know, if they're sitting in a bedroom, does that influence as an assessor the way that we interpret things? Do you think differently about somebody in terms of unconsciously with artificial backgrounds? You know, I can put a library up behind me or whatever. Does that alter the way that you think about somebody in terms of your unconscious biases? And the honest answer is that we don't know at the moment, but I think they are areas that we need to think about. It's always challenging if somebody has not got the most reliable internet and they're a bit jumpy on the screen. It's very difficult to not penalize somebody for that, which is not their fault. But if there's a time lag between what they're saying and what you're hearing, that makes the consultation look a little bit unprofessional. But actually, that's just you observing it. And we've got all these biases that I think we just have to start to understand and train our examiners in. I think there's a lot about examiner training that we need to look at the more that we do these e-assessments. I'm just going to stop my share because I can't see everybody else so easily at the moment. Matthew, did you want to add anything there in terms of the bias side?
Mark, can you just explain? I wasn't sure when you say bias, but you mean what exactly, in what context? You are.
It's the way that we make decisions, because we make these rapid decisions about candidates, often very early in the start of a station, and that's being influenced in ways I don't think we yet understand when we're doing e-assessments, because there's info about the technology, info about the background, all of those influence subconsciously our pattern recognition, our rapid decision making, and we need to train our examiners to be aware of that. And I think a lot of this is about awareness as an examiner.
Yeah, but Marga, that's a good point, because I find in the past, particularly with the Pesos exam, there were probably about 5 to 6 examiners were making decisions, but now it is 10 examiners. They are independently marked, and also they are not supposed to confer when they are marking. And we also look at the concordance between 2 examiners to see whether there is some form of agreement. If so, we can actually pick up people who are hawks and doves in terms of assessment. And also I find with the communication assessment, where I can also observe as an administrator, I can see how the skills and the examiner's reaction and how they are marked. So I think the bias is there, you're right, it is going to be an issue. We are all different in a way that we mark and we assess, but we can only minimize it by sticking to that particular skills which we talked about. When you specifically know that what exactly being assessed, and then you can be more specific. And very interesting.
I think that's a really interesting point that you've made there, Matthew, that we probably haven't really explored the real benefits here. We historically, just in face-to-face, only have a couple of examiners. With remote based assessments, we could have a much bigger group of people examining each candidate. We can record very easily consultations. So the best way to reduce bias is to get multiple assessors scoring. And actually e-assessment may give us some advantages there over conventional face-to-face.
Yeah. And also it's interesting, but if you do mark the candidate down, Mark, the college advises that you have to justify your comments. So let's say that you mark them down, you need to justify why you thought the candidate hasn't reached the pass marks. And those comments are sent to the candidate in the feedback. So if 2 examiners say that you failed one candidate and other examiner passed, if there's a 2-point discrimination, it makes it very obvious for the candidate and people how you can make those 2 judgments. That still happens, but by doing this, being open and transparent, and there is something that people can appeal, and those things are being looked at. And I think that is probably the way forward, I think, when it comes to reducing the bias.
I think that's a great discussion on bias. For example, increasing the number of examiners. And also what I thought was, Mark, probably in future, now you said about the background, whether the background will have an effect on the mark that you give a candidate. So probably there may be in future guidelines for candidates. This is the background you should have. A white background or whatever, like for certain photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've got background envy for Gitanjali's background. I think that looks very impressive. I'm feeling inadequate.
That was actually the background that was sent to me to be put by the Colombo conference.
Yeah. And so we may be,
it was very impressive.
Yeah, you're like
we may actually be requiring candidates to have set backgrounds so that every candidate has the same background. So these are things that are evolving as time goes on. I think the great thing about this afternoon's discussions is we can learn from one another, and we haven't got the solutions, and we're all experimenting with this technology. And I've got a few really helpful tips that I can take away from the discussions this morning. This afternoon. I hope everybody who's on the call has just picked up a few things that they're thinking, oh, that's interesting, I might like to try that. And then if we can share our experiences, we can all improve the quality of these e-assessments.
Absolutely, Mark. That is correct. So shall we, I think we are time up and people are leaving. Can I just ask Tiaini to wind up the session?
Thank you. So we have a wonderful session and we have come to the end. I am really honored and it's my pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the organizing committee. First of all, I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Mark Lilicrap, Dr. Rajaratnam Mathialagan, and Professor Gominda Ponnamperuma for taking time to speak to us on a much needed topic this evening or this morning. For someone. Thank you very much for a wonderful session and we learned a lot. We also would like to thank the candidate Dr. Christian Alcock and Surrogate Nicholas Kirwan. Thank you very much for an excellent mock session. We learned a lot and we can actually practice we can do this for some of our assessment. It's really very useful and we must thank the technical team for uninterrupted webinar. It's a very successful webinar without no hiccups. Thank you very much. Last but not least, the participants. Very active and involved participants. It's without you, we cannot achieve this webinar. Once again, thank you everyone for your contribution and participation and making this webinar a special one. Hope everyone have learned something from this webinar. Thank you very much. Thanks again. Hope we will continue this kind of in future as well. I prefer in person as well as virtual. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Madhi. Thank you, Gominda. Thank you, Geeta. And also Cicera, Kosala, Vasana, Pavitra, and the technical Dr. Tamika. Everyone, and so I apologize if I missed anyone. Have a good day or good evening and good afternoon. I think Mark is good afternoon, going to be Mark and Madhi, right?
Yeah.
Okay, see you soon, virtually as well as in person, hopefully in 2022.
Yeah.
We can meet.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
That was really nice. We really enjoyed it. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Does somebody want to, Tamika, did you want to just stop the recording?